The end times can be scary. If you are a Christian, and you have been a Christian specifically, earlier in the 2000s, maybe a little bit before that, there was a series called the Left Behind series, and it made people absolutely terrified of the end times, and rightfully so. Those movies were so scary. I remember being a child and walking around the house, and anytime there was a pile of clothes, if there was a pile of clothes like left on an office chair, I was like, oh no, my dad was raptured and I was left behind. It's scary, especially because the Bible talks about some stuff. And when you read Jesus talking about the end times, or you read the book of Revelation, it's hard to understand. It's difficult to read. It's difficult to interpret, and that's the reality. You're looking at apocalyptic literature. That's a specific genre of Bible literature. You have to know how to interpret that apocalyptic literature to know even what to do with Revelation. And so if you're like me and you have been confused in the past about all this, I want to kind of give us a bit of a framework. Specifically today, we're talking about the millennial reign of Christ. That's the 1,000-year reign of Jesus. And so if you have been confused by the end times, I understand, but I want to help you out, so this is the video for you. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Pastor John. It's always good to see you. On this channel, we talk about deconstructing the culture. And so you've heard of people deconstructing their faith. Well, we need to deconstruct the culture and look and see how the gospel applies to it. What lies are we being sold? We also talk about growing in the faith. We want to deepen our understanding of Christ, deepen our commitment to living out the word of Christ and having that flow out into the culture around us. And part of growing in your faith is understanding the Bible. Understanding the Bible is absolutely paramount in your life to living a faithful life with Jesus, but it does get difficult when you're talking about apocalyptic literature. Now, apocalyptic literature, the book of Revelation, it should not be something that separates Christians. To me, it breaks my heart when Christians decide to separate over something that is so difficult to exegete like it is. Exegete means pulling the information out of the text, making sure you're getting at what the original author intended. It's difficult with apocalyptic literature. And so when Christians separate over apocalyptic literature, I don't think that's the wisest decision, because there are things that are called core beliefs. Those are the things, core beliefs, those are the things that we should separate over. If somebody does not believe that Jesus is the eternal Son of God, you should separate with them. If somebody doesn't believe that Jesus is the only way to heaven, you should separate from them. If they don't believe that the Bible is inspired, inerrant, and infallible, those people should be separated from Orthodox Christianity. So you have that primary issue, or the primary, core beliefs of the faith, and then you have things that are convictions. So you have the Calvinism-Arminian debate. That's a secondary issue. That's not primary to the faith. You could be an Arminian and be saved. You could be a Calvinist and be saved. After that, you have things that are called preferences. Do you like having drums in church or not? Now, there are people, I'm a worship pastor, there are people who would make that a salvific issue on drums and electric guitars, but it's not. That's a preference thing. So we should hold those things more loosely. And the last thing is speculation, speculative issues. Now, I believe that your interpretation of the book of Revelation is actually speculative, because no matter what happens, whatever you decide is not what's going to happen. What God has already predetermined before the foundations of the world, that's what's going to happen. That's why we can say that Jesus is not plan B, Jesus is plan A. And so we're spectators. We're sitting off to the side going, Lord, however you decide to do it, I'm in. So when you're talking about the millennial reign of Christ, there's three main views. One, the first view we're not going to get into much, is the post-millennial view. And that's that, humanity gets better and better and better and better and better until all of a sudden one day the earth has been transformed because the gospel has gone forth. That's not a very widely held view, but it is a view, and it's a wrong view. So if that's where you're at, that's fine. But I don't feel like it's the most biblical. Like when you read, I was reading this morning in the book of Matthew, like when you read some of those things, it doesn't sound like it's getting better and better and better. Then you have historic premillennialism, and we'll get into that. And then you have amillennialism, which is kind of like saying there's no millennial, but that's not totally accurate. And so let's get into it. Hey guys, just want to interrupt this video real quick to ask you to subscribe to the channel. We're on our way to 1,000. This channel, we put in a ton of work, or I put in a ton of work to it. And it's just a wonderful time. Again, we deconstruct culture and we grow in our faith. If that's interesting to you, subscribe to the channel and like this video for the sake of the YouTube algorithm, because for some reason, that's the thing that YouTube loves. So thanks, guys. Let's get back into the video. So today we're going to be watching a video, and instead of me explaining it and just kind of butchering all of it, like, look, I have studied this. I went to seminary. I studied all this, and because it is one of those, for me, I think it's a speculation issue. I haven't spent a ton of time on it, so I want to go to somebody who has spent a ton of time on this, has a good explanation so that I don't butcher it and we can all learn together. Now, I've come to this video a few times. This is Dr. Thomas Schreiner. He is brilliant. He is part of Southern Seminary, and I found this video super helpful. And you can tell he's smart because he sounds super smart. So let's get into it. Let's look at this video. So this is talking about historic premillennialism, which is different from dispensational premillennialism. I'm not going to get into that, but here we go.
Agree with that today. So arguments in favor of premillennialism, if you consider Revelation 20. Well, one of the arguments is in Revelation 19.
Now, real quick, he has a couple of arguments. We're not going to go through all the arguments because this would be a very, very, very long video. This is already going to be a long video, I can tell. But he's got like 5 or 6 different arguments, but he has a little plot twist at the end.
Verses 11 through 21, Jesus comes on the white horse. He returns. He destroys his enemies. He throws the false prophet and the beast into hell. And then Revelation 20 opens, and
real quick, is this guy giving you a little bit of Q-tip vibes?
John says, and I saw, and then in this passage, the angel comes and throws Satan into the abyss, into the pit, for 1,000 years. And premillennialists argued, look, we have a sequence here. First, in Revelation 19, Jesus returns and destroys.
Now, mind you, the premillennialist view is reading the Bible literally, which I think in most cases is the way you should do it. With apocalyptic literature, it can be different. Let's keep going.
Destroys the beast and the false prophet and the enemies, the human enemies allied with that. And then in Revelation 20, we have a new event where the angel takes hold of Satan and puts him in the abyss for 1,000 years. So that's one argument. Another argument in favor of premillennialism is that in Revelation chapter 12, Satan is cast down to the earth. So he's thrown to the earth when he has that big battle with Michael, but he's still active on earth.
When you read those things in Revelation, like the big battle with Michael, bro, talk about a cool book of the Bible.
Whereas in Revelation 20, he's put into the abyss. So what premillennialists say, it's in a very good argument. Look, in Revelation 12, he's cast down to the earth, but he's still active on earth. But in Revelation 20, he's thrown into the abyss, and the abyss is locked, and it's sealed, and he doesn't disturb people for 1,000 years.
That sounds like a really good argument. If you're going to read the book of Revelation literally, that's a fantastic argument.
And they say those are 2 distinct events. This sealing and locking of Satan into the abyss or the pit, they'll say that just hasn't happened yet, which leads to a third argument. It's really quite similar. Right now, Satan is the god of this world. He's the prince of the power of the air. Right now, he's still deceiving people. He's deceiving nations. But Revelation 20 says he's locked in the abyss and that he can't deceive the nations anymore.
Right. So right now when we're alive, you can tell when somebody is being swayed by a satanic argument or just like a really worldly argument. You got the world, the flesh, and the devil all trying to pull people away. And so we can tell that Satan is not in that final locked away resting place because people are still being affected. So I like this argument a lot.
So premillennialists say, obviously, that hasn't happened yet. Satan's still deceiving the nations. So we have not yet seen this 1,000-year period where Satan is locked into the abyss and he's not deceiving the nations.
Now that would be before being thrown into the eternal lake of fire.
A fourth really good argument for the premillennial view is John talks about these martyrs in Revelation.
So I love this part of his argument, these martyrs.
Chapter 20. And John says they came to life and they reigned for 1,000 years. And the argument is that that verb, they came to life, means they are raised from the dead. You can look in chapter 2. We have the same word that is used in terms of Jesus himself. And clearly it means Jesus was raised from the dead. And more than this, so you have these martyrs who come to life, who are raised to life resurrected in the premillennial view, and they reign for 1,000 years. And then in 1,000 years later, the rest come to life. Same verb.
So you've got two different resurrections from the dead. Pretty good arguments. Now he gets into a little bit of what N.T. Wright says about this, and it's a thing that theologians do. Like, this word means this here, and this word doesn't mean this over there, and it's like, how did you decide? And I get it. Context is absolutely key, but like, who makes that final decision?
So there's a sequence. 1,000 years pass, the rest come to life. Even amillennialists argue that the rest coming to life includes the physical resurrection. So that's very interesting, isn't it? The first verb, the martyrs come to life and reign for 1,000 years. Premillennialists say that's a physical resurrection. Amillennialists don't think that first resurrection is a physical resurrection. But the next statement, and 1,000 years later, the rest come to life, and they argue that includes a physical resurrection. So this is a little bit complicated, but premillennialists say, I think the argument overall is simple. Premillennialists say, look, the verb means the same thing.
Yeah.
In both cases, it refers to a physical resurrection. So that's the fourth argument.
So we're going to stop there for the arguments of premillennialist, and then we're going to get into amillennial. All right, so now he gets into his amill argument, and it's really good.
What are the arguments in favor of amillennialism? So the first argument is, nowhere else in Scripture do we read about this 1,000-year reign of Christ. And
to understand what he's doing with that, whenever you interpret Scripture, you always have to interpret Scripture by Scripture. And so you have to say, like, hey, where does this sentence fit in the chapter? Where does that chapter fit in the book? Where does this book sit in the Testament? And where does that Testament fit in the meta-narrative of Scripture? And so if you're going to interpret the Bible that way, then you're going, okay, well, where else do I see these things happening?
Simpler to say the second coming and the last judgment take place at the same time. Because if you're a premillennialist, right, you have the resurrection of the saints and the second coming separated by 1,000 years. So that's possible, but that's not as neat and clean.
Right.
So in the amillennial scheme is cleaner. Jesus comes, the dead are raised. It's the last judgment. You go into the new heavens and the new earth. Revelation 21 and 22.
So I don't think that because something is clean is a good argument to believe it. I get it. Hey, we're living in the minimalist age. We want to be clean-lined. We want all the design to be clean. But just because a story is cleaner is not a good reason. So that's not a strong argument. But he's got much more strong arguments.
So that's the first argument. It's simple. And it's clean. You don't see the millennium spoken of anywhere else.
So now he gets into what I think is his strongest argument, and that is something that we see multiple times in the Scriptures, where people are telling something from different perspectives. You know, people get confused when you have the Synoptic Gospels telling stories in a different way or in a different order. Well, people see things differently. They experience things differently, and so I really, really like this argument.
Thirdly, what about Revelation 20 itself? What about the argument that you have a sequence? In chapter 19, verses 11 through 21, Jesus returns. Then the next event in Revelation 20 is that Satan is thrown into the abyss by the angel. I mean, of course, that's possible. But you could also argue that what we have here is recapitulation. One of the features
big words
of Revelation is recursive, or it recapitulates, retells the same events from different perspectives.
Now that's the same way, like when you're reading, when you read books that have the same thing happen over and over, or like the Old Testament recapitulates. It has, you read about the story of David, and then you read other historical parts of the Bible, and it just tells the same thing again. It's not as clean as we like it in our modern writing, but that's the way that they wrote. Things that were important came up multiple times.
And it's a very interesting thing here, because in Revelation 19, John alludes to Ezekiel 38 and 39, but he also alludes to Ezekiel 38 and 39 in Revelation 20, in the judgment of Satan. And I would argue, along with Dan Block, who I think wrote the best commentary out there on Ezekiel.
Okay, pal, you need to calm down with that.
Dan argues that the judgments in Ezekiel 38 and 39 are the same judgment told from different perspectives. Do you see my point here? My point is the judgment in Revelation 19, appealing to Ezekiel 38 and 39, and the judgment in Revelation 20, appealing to Ezekiel 38 and 39, are referring to the same account, the same story, just from different perspectives. So it isn't so clear that we have a sequence here. It could be the same event. You know, you shake up the kaleidoscope, but it's the same event told from a different perspective.
Again, all of this has to deal with how you interpret a text. When you're studying apocalyptic literature, there are times where things happen in a confusing way like that. And so it could be talking about one thing here and saying it a different way, but talking about the same thing here in a different spot. So to understand apocalyptic literature, you have to know more about the culture around them. So I just like people come to these conclusions about apocalyptic literature by reading it literally. And for the most part, I think when you're studying the scriptures, that's how you should do it. But you wouldn't read a love letter from your wife the same way you would read a doctoral dissertation from a student.
I think that's more likely. So, fourth argument. What about the fact that Satan is thrown into the abyss and he can no longer deceive the nations? Again, I want to say the premillennial argument is very good.
Yeah.
And maybe it's right. But,
I love that humility because, look, man, if you find somebody who is teaching and they're like, this is the only way to view it, this is it, don't listen to that person. They're not intellectually honest. This is a confusing book. And so I like somebody who's humble enough. So maybe that person's right.
I think there's a good answer to that. And I think the answer is we remember when it says Satan is cast to the earth and Satan is cast into the abyss. We have to remember we're dealing with apocalyptic language.
Right.
We have to be careful not to overly literalize either of those visions. So what is the point of both of those visions? Are they harmonious? And I would actually argue they refer to the same period of time. That is, the period after Jesus' death and resurrection. So Satan is bound and put into the pit for 1,000 years, but Matthew chapter 12, Jesus says he has come to bind the strong man, which is clearly Satan. So I think if we look at Matthew chapter 12, that binding of Satan is understood to have taken place in Jesus' ministry through his cross and resurrection. That can be pictured, Revelation 12, as Satan being cast to the earth. And it can be pictured as Satan being cast into the abyss. But what about the point? Satan can't deceive the nations. Isn't he deceiving the nations? But I think all Mills have a good reply to that. And the reply is this, that in the Old Covenant, God's special people was Israel, and the gospel was not going out to the nations. Satan was deceiving the nations virtually completely, comprehensively, totally. So amillennialists are not arguing that Satan is not doing any work of deception now. I think he is. But Revelation 20 is speaking specifically to the issues, is Satan deceiving the nations as a whole so they're not hearing the gospel? And the answer is no. In this present evil age, the gospel is going to the ends of the earth, and some from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation are believing.
Yeah, I live in Orlando, Florida, which is the capital of every major, humongous missions agency. And hearing where the gospel is going forth right now, it is extremely encouraging. And so obviously Satan is not deceiving to the point where nobody is hearing the gospel, anywhere.
So Satan is bound in the sense that he's no longer preventing the nations, as in the Old Testament, from hearing the gospel. Fifth argument.
This is good.
What about the statement that the martyrs came to life?
Yeah. To me, the martyrs are so important in this whole text. Like, if you can explain what's going on with the martyrs, you can explain the timeline.
For 1,000 years, which I'm going to mix this together with, and John's saying this is the first resurrection. Maybe I'll talk about that last part first. Remember what I said about N.T. Wright. Anastasis, the word resurrection, always refers to a physical resurrection. And then Wright says, but it doesn't in Revelation 20. And some people say, well, he's basically cheating. But I think Wright could be correct here.
Can you just say you think Wright is right, please? Don't say Wright is correct. You ruined it.
I actually think he is correct. I mean, why would he even say that? I think the answer is we're dealing with apocalyptic literature. The terms take their meaning and context. And so we have to be careful when we're talking about apocalyptic, and especially the way the book of Revelation is written, over-literalizing the use of a term. So I would argue that first resurrection is spiritual. It is the reign of believers in heaven with Christ. That's the first resurrection. And that is the sense that John has in mind when he says they came to life. Yes, there is a second coming to life where it's physical.
Right. To be absent of body is to be present with the Lord. When you die, suddenly you are more alive than you've ever been in your entire earthly life. So that's what he's talking about here.
But Meredith Kline has made a very interesting argument here in regard to these things that I think is helpful. Meredith Kline says there's a first resurrection, which implies there's a second resurrection. The first resurrection is spiritual. That second resurrection is physical. And John speaks of a second death. The second death is hell. But there's a first death, isn't there? There's a first death where people do not know God in this life. And we're all born into the first death, so to speak. But the decisive issue is, do you experience the second death? So you see the parallel here? First resurrection means you have spiritual life. First death, spiritual death. Second resurrection, physical resurrection. Second death, physical resurrection, and life in hell. So I think that's a good amillennial answer. This debate will go on.
Yeah. So he goes on to say this debate it's going on, and it does go on, and it's good. And if you are certain about your stance, that's fantastic. But I would operate with humility here, because it is a little bit confusing. And so for me, when I hold those two things in tension, those two views in tension, I'm like, man, there are good arguments on both. And it really is going to come down to, for you, it's going to depend on, do you interpret the scriptures literally, specifically when you're talking about the book of Revelation, when you're talking about apocalyptic literature, are you going to interpret that literally, or are you going to interpret that figuratively? And so that's a pretty big deal. So in the comments, go ahead and tell me, what are you convinced of? Are you a premillennialist? Are you an amillennialist? Maybe you're a postmillennialist and you're the odd one out. But go ahead and type that down in the comments below. Tell me if Dr. Schreiner was convincing on any of these arguments. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and maybe you would like to know if you can actually trust the Bible. If so, go ahead and click this video right here.